Please be advised the following material is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This report contains the exact federal courtroom testimony from the Sean Diddy Combs trial, as documented by Inner City Press. The courtroom was silent. Tension clung to the walls like smoke as Alicia Keys stepped forward, not as a performer, not as the woman behind global hits and Grammy Awards, but as a witness carrying the weight of nearly 2 decades of silence. What she revealed in that room shattered not just illusions, but reputations, careers, and possibly empires. This wasn't just another celebrity testimony. This was Alicia Keys, an icon of strength and soul, detailing events so dark, so controlled, and so deeply hidden that even the most cynical courtroom observers found themselves holding their breath. The federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs had already captivated the public, with accusations of trafficking, racketeering, and sexual abuse swirling through media channels like wildfire. But no one expected Alicia to take the stand. Her presence alone changed the gravity of the case. She wasn't there to speak in metaphors. She had receipts, physical evidence, journals, text messages, even video. The year was 2006. Alicia's album was in development. Her career was soaring, and like many others at the top of their game, she was invited to Diddy's now infamous white party in the Hamptons. But as she explained, it wasn't really an invitation. In the music industry, when someone like Diddy summons you, you don't say no, especially if you want to remain on top. The estate was lavish, everything dripping in wealth. Celebrities in all white attire, champagne towers, tents stretching across the manicured lawn. On the surface, it was glamour. But behind it, something darker moved. As the party wore on, Alicia noticed a pattern. Certain guests were pulled aside, whispered to by assistants, then slowly ushered into the main house, specifically to a secluded space only known by a cryptic name. The room. She didn't think much of it, that is, until it was her turn. Just after midnight, one of Diddy's personal assistants approached her. The message was clear. Diddy wanted to speak with her privately in the room, supposedly about a collaboration for her upcoming album. It seemed like a routine industry meeting, but the way it was presented held a strange weight. Alicia followed. Through grand hallways, past guarded checkpoints, until her phone was taken. She was told it was for privacy. That industry deals happened here. No photos, no leaks. Just trust. But nothing about what came next felt professional. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with perfume and tension. The decor was lush, almost seductive, plush velvet seating, dark red walls, art pieces that later turned out to conceal hidden cameras. A private bar glowed in the corner, tended by someone who never spoke. The doors closed behind her. Locked. She described a strange calm at first. Whispers filled the space, laughter too rehearsed, drinks being poured and left untouched. Around her, artists mingled with executives. But it wasn't networking, it was a silent audition. Then Diddy approached. What he said wasn't threatening, but it carried weight. He spoke of choice, of how careers were built here, how success was reserved for those willing to play the game. Then he led her further in. And that's when Alicia saw it. A young female artist, newly signed, being pressured into compromising acts in full view of powerful men. She didn't look willing, just lost. Diddy stood nearby, nodding, whispering. And then Alicia noticed Jay-Z. Seated in the corner, quietly taking notes in a black notebook. He didn't participate, but he watched. She described it not as an event, but as a ritual. One designed to collect leverage. To make sure everyone in that room could be controlled, either by tape or by fear. If you played along, they had evidence. If you didn't, they made sure you knew the cost. Alicia froze. She didn't know whether to run or pretend to be okay. Everything in her screamed that this wasn't a meeting. It was a trap. And once you were inside the room, you were already caught. Eventually, she found her way out without creating a scene, but the real trap came later. Days after the party, a call from a blocked number came. A voice simply said they were glad she attended and trusted she'd stay discreet. Then a package arrived at her private home. A USB drive, unmarked. On it, footage. of her walking into the room, of Diddy's voice in the background saying that everyone who entered belonged to the family now. That was the leash. She hadn't done anything illegal, but just appearing in that space was enough. It was a warning. A message. And it worked. Over the following years, Alicia began noticing shifts. Radio play for her singles dropped. Collaborations vanished without explanation. Industry friends stopped returning calls. Rumors swirled about her being difficult, arrogant, ungrateful. It was a slow isolation. And she knew exactly where it was coming from. Every time she declined an invitation from Diddy. Every time she refused to bring another artist into his private circle. The pressure mounted. But she stayed quiet, because she didn't know who to trust, because she was afraid, and because silence was safer than retaliation. But all that changed when Cassie's lawsuit surfaced. When surveillance footage of Diddy assaulting her leaked. When more women started speaking out, Alicia felt something shift inside her. Not fear. Anger. She realized silence was no longer an option. She reached out to federal investigators herself. She provided copies of the USB, of her journals, text messages, everything she'd buried for years. And now, here she was, standing in court. She wasn't crying, she wasn't yelling. Her voice didn't shake. She spoke clearly, as though each word was a blade cutting through years of manipulation. She said Diddy built a system. One that didn't need direct threats. It used rumors, reputation, and the machine of the industry to keep people compliant. And when someone stepped out of line, the punishment was silent but brutal. Alicia wasn't just testifying about one night. She was laying bare the architecture of control in the entertainment world. A structure built on fear, compliance, and blackmail. And at its center, she placed Diddy. The judge, the jury, even the press, all were shaken. And as she reached the final lines of her testimony, Alicia said something that echoed through the courtroom like a bell. That if they didn't stop this system now, it would never end. That new young artists would continue walking into rooms like that, thinking it was opportunity, not knowing it was entrapment. As Alicia stepped down from the stand, there was no applause, just silence. Jay-Z stood up and quietly left the courtroom. His expression unreadable. Diddy sat frozen, his skin pale, his fingers trembling slightly. And Alicia? She walked straight past the cameras, past the reporters, past the noise. Because her job was done, for now, but this was only the beginning. The silence after Alicia Keys' testimony was just the surface. Beneath it churned decades of whispers, cover-ups, and unspoken truths. What had happened in that courtroom wasn't just the unraveling of Diddy's image. It was the beginning of an industry reckoning. But what Alicia carried with her after leaving that room in 2006 was not just trauma. It was surveillance, isolation, and manipulation so calculated, it blurred the line between paranoia and reality. She had tried to convince herself it wasn't real. That maybe she misread the room. That maybe the footage on the USB was just routine. But every time she tried to forget, another sign reminded her. The sudden drop in radio rotation. Invitations that stopped arriving. Collaborations quietly cancelled with no explanation. Her name began to shift in meetings. No longer Alicia Keys, the star everyone wanted to work with. Now she was being labeled as hard to work with, distant, unreliable. She remembered one particular phone call. It was brief. A male voice on the other end simply said, "Hope you enjoyed the room." It was a reminder that she had been seen. Recorded. Tracked. That wasn't just paranoia. It was fact. She began to piece together the mechanics of how Diddy operated. He didn't need to threaten people directly. He had built a machine, an entire network of executives, radio hosts, PR firms, and journalists who helped maintain his control. If someone refused him, the machine responded. Sometimes subtly. Sometimes ruthlessly. Alicia said she experienced that machinery firsthand. Her album, which had been poised for a major push, suddenly began facing delays. Billboard placements dropped unexpectedly. Award nominations disappeared. Interviews were cancelled, and magazines that had confirmed covers with her quietly pulled back. No one said why. She started seeing the pattern. This wasn't incompetence or bad timing. This was pressure. From the top. Then came the requests. Invitations to more private events. Always delivered through intermediaries. Some sounded innocent: dinners, networking mixers, listening parties. But after the room, Alicia knew what they meant. They wanted her to bring someone. Another female artist. Someone young. Someone ambitious. Someone unaware. That was the part that broke her. She refused, and every refusal came with consequences. Her team began to splinter. Longtime collaborators distanced themselves. Friends in the industry grew cold. It wasn't just professional isolation, it was personal. She received another package 6 months after the party. A photo this time. It showed her, in the room, holding a drink. Her face frozen in discomfort. No note. No return address. Just the image. A warning. That was when the insomnia began. Sleepless nights spent wondering how far the surveillance went. If her phone was tapped. If her home was being watched. If she had ever truly been alone since that night. She kept all the materials, photos, USBs, journals. Not because she was planning to go public. But because she wanted proof. Something to remind herself that she wasn't imagining it. And yet, for years, she said nothing. Because silence bought her time. Time to protect her family. Time to rebuild. But then came Cassie. When Cassie's lawsuit against Diddy hit the headlines, something shifted. The stories sounded familiar. The language used in the complaint mirrored things Alicia had heard whispered for years. Rooms. Invitations. Pressure. Isolation. Then came the surveillance video from the hotel. She watched it, alone, at night. She had seen enough. She made the call the next morning. Not to a lawyer. Not to her publicist. But to a federal investigator. She told them everything. The white party. The room. The footage. The threats. The network of silence. At first, they were skeptical. But then she provided proof. Dates. Names. Images. Audio files. The tone of the investigation changed overnight. Alicia was no longer just a witness. She was a key that unlocked an entire system. Behind the scenes, she started cooperating fully. Quietly. Without alerting the media. She met with prosecutors. Shared everything she had. Even things that hadn't happened directly to her but that she had heard whispered in private green rooms, backstage corridors, and industry dinners. She knew that testifying in open court meant sacrificing whatever peace she had left, but she had reached her limit. In the courtroom, she didn't speak like a victim. She spoke like someone who had seen how the game was played and finally chose to flip the board. She told the jury that after 2006, she spent years second-guessing her own worth. Not because she lacked talent, but because everything in the industry became conditional. Radio play required favors. Awards required loyalty. Press coverage required compliance. She said she watched other artists rise, not because they were better, but because they played along. She described watching young female artists she had mentored slowly get pulled into the same cycle. Some disappeared. Some changed overnight. Some never made it back. And the worst part? Most of them thought it was normal, that this was the price of success. Alicia began mentoring in private. Warning others. Quietly offering support. But she knew it wasn't enough. Until she spoke publicly, the system would keep grinding. And so, she prepared herself for court. She knew that the industry would retaliate. That PR firms would spin narratives. That powerful figures would distance themselves. She expected the smears, the edited videos, the cold shoulders. But she also knew what she had. Proof. Documents. Videos. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak until now. As she sat in the witness chair, she said she didn't feel powerful, she felt free. She told the court that her success was no longer a gift from the industry. It was something she reclaimed by speaking out. Every song she had written since that night in 2006 carried echoes of what she endured. And she wasn't the only one. Her testimony triggered a wave of calls to federal investigators, other artists, former assistants, security guards, even drivers, all with stories, all with receipts. The room wasn't just real, it was part of a larger system. And now, the cracks were spreading. Alicia had become the spark. Back outside the courtroom, the music world scrambled. Labels issued statements of support. Artists distanced themselves from Diddy. Social media was flooded with old photos, interviews, red carpet clips. Everything reanalyzed through a new lens. Fans connected the dots. The party photos where stars looked uncomfortable. The interviews where they avoided Diddy's name. The sudden career disappearances that never made sense, now they did. The public wasn't just shocked, they were enraged. They demanded to know how many people had seen the signs and said nothing. How many executives protected the system. How many artists were used, discarded, silenced. And most of all, who would speak next, because Alicia's testimony had opened the door. But behind it stood hundreds of others, some afraid, some ashamed, some ready. The reckoning wasn't over. And Diddy, who once controlled the narrative, now sat powerless. No longer the architect. No longer the gatekeeper. Just another man watching his empire begin to collapse. And Alicia? She had one final card to play, but that would come next. Alicia Keys had spoken. And the world was listening. But what followed her courtroom testimony was far more explosive than anyone could have imagined. Her words didn't just echo in that chamber. They cracked open a vault of secrets that had kept the entertainment industry locked in silence for decades. Back at the Manhattan courthouse, federal investigators were overwhelmed. Alicia's testimony had become the catalyst. Calls started flooding in. Former staffers from record labels. Artists who had left the spotlight without explanation. Makeup artists, stylists, choreographers. Each carried pieces of the same puzzle. There had been others in the room. Not just in 2006, but every year after that. Different cities. Different estates. But always the same setup. Invitations disguised as opportunities. Rooms dressed as luxury spaces. Drinks laced with coercion. Surveillance disguised as security. Alicia had named names. Some were obvious. Others were whispered. Powerful producers. Chart-topping performers. Executives with influence over entire labels. Some had participated. Some had observed. Some had remained silent. But silence, in this system, was complicity. The prosecution team quickly realized the scope had grown. What began as a trial focused on Diddy now pointed toward an entire infrastructure of enablers. The black notebooks. The USB drives. The secret camera feeds. These weren't isolated tools. They were part of a coordinated system designed not just to control artists, but to own them. Alicia had brought her final weapon to court. A small, plain USB. The one sent to her in 2006. She had made copies. Given them to federal investigators. The footage showed her walking into the room, visibly tense. But more than that, it showed others. Artists. Executives. Security. And it had Diddy's voice, clear as day. Everyone who enters the room belongs to the family now. This wasn't metaphor. It was a declaration. That clip alone was enough to trigger a chain reaction. Prosecutors moved quickly. Subpoenas were issued. Cell phones were seized. Diddy's personal tech team was interrogated. Server farms were identified. Hidden accounts traced. And most damning of all, a physical archive was discovered in one of Diddy's storage properties in upstate New York. Inside were hard drives. Labeled by year. Cross-referenced with guest lists, with footage, with names. It was evidence. And it was damning. While the legal team built their case, the world outside was shifting. The music industry went into a tailspin. Emergency board meetings were called. Executives scrambled to separate their brands from the unfolding scandal. Contracts were frozen. Tours postponed. PR firms burned the midnight oil, trying to construct new narratives for their clients. But no narrative could protect them anymore. The public had seen enough. Social media erupted. Hashtags trended for days. Artists who had once proudly spoken about their relationships with Diddy now backpedaled. Some deleted photos. Others issued vague statements about healing and accountability. But fans weren't buying it. The demand was clear. Who else was in the room? And then more names started leaking. Not just from Alicia, but from others who had finally found the courage to speak. An R&B singer who disappeared from the charts in 2008. A former boy band member who'd left the industry citing creative differences. A backup dancer who had been blacklisted after rejecting an invitation. They all told similar stories. And now, with Alicia's evidence paving the way, their voices were harder to ignore. Meanwhile, Diddy remained frozen. His team denied everything, called it a smear campaign, a coordinated takedown. But the footage said otherwise. The silence from his once loyal allies was deafening. And then came the biggest twist. Jay-Z was subpoenaed. Alicia had mentioned him. Sitting in the corner. Writing in a notebook. Not participating, but observing. That notebook, prosecutors believed, could be crucial. The day he walked into court, there was no press conference. No entourage. Just a man carrying years of secrets. Jay-Z's testimony wasn't hostile, but it wasn't protective either. He confirmed being in the room. Said he never participated. Claimed he believed it was just industry politics, that he didn't understand the full extent. But the jury didn't seem convinced. Because Jay-Z wasn't just a bystander. He was one of the few powerful enough to challenge Diddy. And he didn't, for years. His testimony drew further backlash. Fans questioned his silence, his past collaborations, his influence on upcoming artists, and worst of all, his awareness. Alicia watched silently from the gallery. She wasn't there to celebrate his fall. She was there to witness the ripple effect of truth. The court proceedings extended beyond Diddy. Multiple executives were named in new indictments. More footage emerged. Contracts were unsealed. NDA violations were exposed. The very foundation of the music industry shook. And Alicia? She never made a public statement. She didn't go on a press tour. She refused interviews. She let the truth speak. Behind closed doors, however, she was working. With victims. With advocacy groups. With lawmakers. She wanted change, not applause. She met with female artists, old and new, offering support and helping them recognize the signs. She pushed for legislation that would require transparency in entertainment contracts, protections for whistleblowers, funding for artists who left due to abuse. And while her public presence remained quiet, her impact grew louder. The music industry was forced to confront itself. Not just the scandals, but the culture that allowed them. The unspoken rules. The power dynamics. The silence bought with fame. Awards shows were canceled. Foundations withdrew honors. Tributes were replaced with investigations. The Hamptons estate where the 2006 party took place was put up for sale, its value plummeting as protesters gathered outside. And Diddy? He sat in court, watching it all fall apart. The empire he had built now stood as evidence against him. The artists he once controlled had become witnesses. The parties he hosted now referred to as crime scenes. In the end, Alicia's final blow wasn't just her testimony. It was her refusal to be part of the system anymore. She didn't just expose what happened in the room. She exposed the reason the room existed. It was never about sex. Never just about blackmail. It was about control. About breaking spirits. About making sure no one ever felt safe enough to say no. But she had said no, and in doing so, she gave others the strength to say it too. Years from now, when people look back on this trial, they won't just talk about the scandal. They'll talk about the woman who sat in silence for 18 years, then stood in truth for 18 minutes, and changed an industry forever. Because some legacies aren't built in studios or stages. Some are built in courtrooms, when the lights are harsh, and the truth is louder than the music. Alicia Keys walked into that room in 2006 thinking it was a business meeting. She walked out 18 years later as the voice that finally broke the silence.